Hi friends, it's Andrew Goodall here again from Nature's Image Photography with another video in my Photography School series where I break down the skills of photography into bite-sized pieces that are easy to understand. This time I'm tackling one of the big subjects, depth of field. But before we get started, it would be great if you could click that subscribe button so you can keep in touch with each new video as I upload them. So, depth of field, what is it? Let's start with a definition, and don't worry if the definition doesn't help you much. It all becomes clearer once we start looking at some pictures. Most of the definitions I've read go something like this. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and furthest objects in a photo that are acceptably in focus. That's not a bad place to start, but to me it doesn't quite tell the whole story, because it could have you believing that the depth of field starts at the first line in this diagram and ends at the second line. So I work on a slightly different definition. Depth of field is the area in front and behind the object you focus on that is also acceptably in focus. So now we alter the diagram to show that the depth of field starts at the point of focus and extends outwards a certain distance towards and away from the camera. It's important to notice that there's a real difference between focus and depth of field. These days DSLR cameras have multiple focus points and there seem to be more with each new generation. With early DSLRs it was a big deal to have 3 focus points. Nowadays we have up to 100 or more on some cameras. All those focus points are there to help the camera select what to focus on, but it can still only focus on one distance at a time. So whether your camera has 10 focus points or 100, if you focus on an object a certain distance away, let's say 10 meters, then you have focused on a point in space 10 meters from the camera. Anything that is in front and behind that point that also seems to be in focus, that's depth of field. Let's take note for a moment of that important term acceptably in focus. Don't think for a moment that things will stay crystal clear and sharp within the depth of field and then suddenly get fuzzy. Depending on a few factors, which I'll come to in a moment, things do get gradually softer as they get further from the point of focus. So depth of field is not really about how much of your photo is perfectly sharp, it's about how much clarity you see in objects in front and behind the point you actually focused on. One final point while we look at the diagrams. Notice that I've shown less depth of field in front of the subject and more depth of field behind. That's how it works in the real world. About a third of your depth of field is closer to the camera and 2/3 is further away. It's a minor point, but it's worth knowing that when it comes to sharpness, you'll have a little more behind the subject and a little less in front. Okay, so diagrams and definitions will only get us so far. Let's look at a couple of actual photos and try to get a clearer picture, pardon the pun. So, here's a shot with a lot of depth of field, and you can see that although I focused a little way into the scene, pretty much everything seems to be in focus. Now a different shot with a shallower depth of field, and you can see the subjects are sharp, but most of what you can see in front and behind is out of focus. With the butterfly, the depth of field is so shallow, the subject is really the only thing in focus. Not only that, you also see that the out of focus background is so soft, the butterfly is totally isolated. It catches the eye immediately because there is literally nothing else in the photo to look at. Now let's look at 2 photos of the same subject, taken with a different depth of field. You might say the stronger depth of field shows us more detail, if detail is what you're looking for, but the shallow depth of field is a softer look which many people find more attractive. And if you think this is just a minor thing that doesn't really matter, here's a great example I use at my workshops. I used a strong depth of field for this flower photo to show just how much a distracting background can pull the eye away from the subject. Then in the next version you discover it wasn't a photo of the flowers at all. It's the praying mantis, which was virtually invisible, lost in all that detail until I isolated it with a shallow depth of field. So it's pretty clear that how you use depth of field is a creative choice that will make a real difference to what people see and appreciate when they look at your photos. In this portrait photo I used more depth of field to highlight not just the model but also the setting she was photographed in. But in this shot I used less depth of field to put all the attention onto the model. Okay, so now you know what depth of field is and you can see how much difference it can make in your photography. Now it's time to show you what factors affect depth of field and how you can control it. Actually, there are 3 factors that control depth of field and it's important to be aware of all of them. I get a bit annoyed at teachers who put too much emphasis on just one of these points and ignore the others, because they all matter. So these are the things that we'll be talking about. The size of the lens, the distance from the subject, and the size of the aperture. In a way they all work hand in hand, but let's start by looking at them one by one. So the first one is about the size of the lens, and the very simple rule is that the larger the lens, the shallower the depth of field becomes. That doesn't mean the actual physical size and weight of the lens, I'm talking about focal length. So photos taken on a wide angle lens of, let's say, 18mm will usually have a lot of depth of field, but a telephoto lens of 100mm will produce less depth of field, and as the lens gets larger, the depth of field will continue to get shallower. Second is the distance from the subject, and the rule is the closer you get to the subject, the shallower the depth of field becomes. This is why landscape photos, where everything in the picture is a long way from the camera, tend to be sharp throughout, while photos taken at close quarters like wildlife often have those softer backgrounds. It's also one of the reasons macro photography can be so challenging. When your subject is only a few centimetres away from the camera, it can be hard to get a whole ant in focus. These two portraits were taken with the same lens. To fit Selena in from head to toe, I had to stand a fair way back. Notice how much clarity there is in this background even where it's not perfectly sharp. Now as I come closer for a head and shoulders portrait, you can see how much softer the background becomes. And remember, both these photos were taken using the exact same focal length. And now we come to the third piece of the depth of field puzzle, the aperture. I'm going to do a separate video all about aperture, so instead of trying to explain all of it, I'm just going to talk about how it affects depth of field. And the rule is, the wider the aperture, the smaller the depth of field becomes. If you're not familiar with aperture yet, a small f-stop number indicates a wider aperture. So starting from the smallest f-stop number you have, you also start at the shallowest depth of field. Then as your f-stop numbers increase, so does the depth of field. So here are some photos taken on a tripod using the same lens and the same distance from the subject. But the photo with the small f-stop number has a very shallow depth of field. When I shoot with a bigger f-stop, the depth of field increases dramatically. Of course, the beauty of having such a big range of f-stops or aperture settings is that you don't have to go to one extreme or the other. If you want just a little more depth of field, like I did for this praying mantis, you can adjust the aperture just by a couple of stops. And for the people who like to get technical, I have to repeat that as the f-stop number gets bigger, the aperture is actually getting smaller, but that's something I'll cover more in my next video. Now, notice that all these examples have something in common, and no, it's not just that they're all flowers. They're all close-up photos. They were taken with a telephoto lens very close to the subject. Why does this matter? Well, the reason you see such a big change in the depth of field is because it was so small to start with. And that's not just a function of the aperture, it's the size of the lens and distance from the subject as well. And this brings me back to a point I made earlier. When it comes to depth of field, it's a mistake to concentrate only on the f-stop. All three factors contribute to what you see in your photos. When you shoot a landscape with a wide-angle lens, the depth of field is huge to start with, so changing your f-stop would make very little difference to shots like these, but it'll make a huge difference to a shot like this. So there you have it. We've now seen that there are three ways to control depth of field, and you don't get to pick just one or the other, they all matter. To go over it one more time, these are the ways to produce a shallower depth of field. Use a larger lens, get closer to the subject, and use a small f-stop number. And of course, if you want more depth of field, you do the opposite. Use a smaller lens, get further away, and if necessary, use a larger f-stop number. That's my quick look at depth of field, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Most of all, I really hope you've learned something. Once you know what it's all about, you're going to see depth of field at work in every photo you look at for the rest of your life. And now, we both have a job to do. You need to get out and do some practice, and I need to get to work on my next video. Be sure to subscribe before you go, and I look forward to sharing more on the fascinating world of creative photography. I'm Andrew Goodall, this is Nature's Image Photography. Thanks for watching.